Welcome to Old School Sundays. I'm your host, Odell. Let's get into some history. The year was 1964. The lights of War Memorial Stadium burned through the Buffalo night as Cookie Gilchrist stood on the sideline. 6'3", 250 pounds of fury and conviction. The crowd roared for touchdowns, but Cookie wasn't listening. His mind was somewhere else, on the owners who called him boy, the coaches who told him to be grateful, the league that cashed his talent but couldn't stomach his truth. He wasn't just a running back, he was a man who believed black players deserved dignity, fair contracts, and a seat at the table. And that belief made him dangerous. Behind the scenes, whispers followed him everywhere. Executives called him too outspoken. Reporters painted him as trouble. But Cookie didn't care. He demanded better pay, better respect, better treatment for the men who broke their bodies every Sunday for a league that saw them as disposable. Then came the breaking point. One act of defiance that turned the AFL's brightest star into its biggest problem. The league wanted him to play, Cookie wanted justice. And in that clash, one of the most dominant careers in football history was quietly erased. So what really happened to Cookie Gilchrist, the man too bold for the NFL? Before Cookie Gilchrist ever carried a football in the NFL, he was already a legend, just not in the country that raised him. Cut from the Cleveland Browns as a teenager for questioning Paul Brown's authority, Cookie headed north, crossing into Canada with nothing but his pride and a grudge. The NFL said he had an attitude problem. The CFL said, "We'll take him." And just like that, the outcast became a phenomenon. For 6 seasons in Canada, Gilchrist dominated both sides of the ball. He ran like Jim Brown, hit like Dick Butkus, and blocked like a man punishing the entire league for doubting him. Fans loved him, teammates respected him, but Cookie never smiled. Because even then, he knew what was waiting back home. An NFL that didn't want outspoken black men with opinions. When he finally returned to the US in 1962, the Buffalo Bills thought they were getting a running back. What they got instead was a revolution in shoulder pads. He led the league in rushing, shattered defenders, and dragged the Bills to an AFL championship. But while the crowd saw touchdowns, Cookie saw something else. Owners getting rich off players who couldn't even afford a house. And that's when the trouble started. Cookie Gilchrist didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to be treated like a man. But in the 1960s, that was the one thing football establishment refused to give him. By 1963, he had become the most dominant player in the AFL, an unstoppable force who could bulldoze linebackers, block for his quarterback, and even kick field goals when asked. On Sundays, he was Superman in shoulder pads. On Mondays, he was a man staring down the system that wanted him silent. Behind closed doors, Gilchrist began pushing for what no one dared to ask for: fair pay, better pensions, and respect for black players who were routinely housed in separate hotels during road trips. When team owners told him to know his place, he fired back with the same ferocity he used on the field. He demanded equal treatment, he demanded to be heard. Then came the breaking point. The 1965 AFL All-Star Game. The league announced it would be held in New Orleans, a city still clinging to Jim Crow. When the black players arrived, they were denied cab rides, refused service at restaurants, and called slurs in the streets. The league told them to focus on football. Cookie told them to go home. He led a player boycott, convincing his teammates that their dignity mattered more than a meaningless exhibition. It was one of the first athlete-led protests in American sports, years before Tommy Smith raised a fist or Muhammad Ali refused induction. Under pressure, the AFL moved the game to Houston, but the victory came with a price. In the boardrooms of pro football, Cookie Gilchrist's name became radioactive. He was no longer seen as a team leader, he was labeled disruptive, uncoachable, too proud. The same strength that made him great on the field now made him an enemy off of it, and the league was about to remind him who really held the power. The phone stopped ringing, the handshakes turned cold. The same league executives who once praised Cookie Gilchrist as a model of toughness now whispered that he was poison. After leading the Buffalo Bills to an AFL championship in 1964 and becoming the face of the franchise, Cookie's relationship with ownership imploded. He had demanded that players be paid fairly for preseason games, a radical idea at that time, and that the team share profits more equitably. The Bills' front office saw that as rebellion. When he confronted management about broken promises and racist treatment, they decided they'd had enough of his voice. In 1965, Buffalo traded their star running back to the Denver Broncos for almost nothing, a move so senseless it shocked the sports world. Publicly, they said it was a football decision. Privately, everyone knew it was a message: speak out and you'll be gone. Denver wanted his body, not his mind. They wanted the hits, not the words. But Cookie wasn't built to be silent. When a coach cursed at him in practice, Gilchrist cursed right back. When teammates called him difficult, he answered with another 100-yard game. He was still unstoppable on the field, but every touchdown felt hollow. The league that once glorified him now pretended he didn't exist. By 1966, his name was being quietly passed around front offices with an unspoken warning: don't touch him. It wasn't official, but everyone understood. Cookie Gilchrist had been blackballed. The NFL and AFL had done what defenses couldn't. They'd finally found a way to stop him. He drifted through Denver, then Miami, still dominating, still defiant, but the love for the game was gone. He wasn't just fighting tacklers anymore, he was fighting an entire system determined to silence him. And just when he thought he could walk away on his own terms, one last betrayal was waiting. This time, from the people who claimed to have his back. By 1967, Cookie Gilchrist had outlasted nearly every barrier the league could throw at him. He'd been traded, blackballed, and branded as a troublemaker. Yet every Sunday, he still found a way to dominate. But behind that stoic glare, the fire that had fueled him for years was turning into exhaustion. The final betrayal didn't come from a single player injury, it came from the quiet meetings in hotel suites and owners' boxes, the places where men in tailored suits decide which players were valuable and which were disposable. Cookie had started to see through the illusion. He saw how the league built empires off the pain and sweat of players who couldn't even negotiate their own futures. He tried to form a players' union long before it was fashionable. He spoke openly about the need for medical benefits and long term care for retired players decades before the concussion crisis would ever make headlines. Instead of being applauded, he was mocked. Reporters twisted his words, team owners whispered that he was greedy, ungrateful, unstable. Then came the money dispute that broke him. When he demanded back pay from Buffalo, bonuses and incentives that were promised but never delivered, the team refused to acknowledge him. Lawsuits followed. So did the headlines, the character attacks, and the slow erasure of his name from team history. To most of America, Cookie Gilchrist simply fell off. But those who knew him, teammates, rivals, and even reporters who admired his defiance, understood the truth. The league hadn't forgotten him, they had erased him. When he walked away from pro football, there was no farewell ceremony, no jersey retirement, no reunion invitation. The same league that built its toughness myth on men like Cookie couldn't face the fact that the toughest man of them all was the one who dared to fight back. He left the game disillusioned, betrayed, but unbroken, carrying a message that would echo for decades: that no championship, no record, and no paycheck is worth your dignity. But Cookie's fight didn't end with football. The world outside the gridiron was changing, and the same spirit that once terrified the league was about to find a new purpose. When the roar of the crowd faded and the headlines stopped coming, most players from that era disappeared quietly. Cookie Gilchrist wasn't built that way. He didn't know how to fade. Even after the NFL had turned its back on him, he carried himself like the game still owed him an explanation. He settled in Western New York for a while, then drifted through small towns across Pennsylvania and Ontario. The man who once led championship parades now drove a pickup truck and lived off odd jobs. Some called it a fall from grace. Cookie saw it differently. He saw it as freedom. For the first time, he didn't have to answer to anyone. He became a mentor to young athletes, speaking in schools and community centers about self worth, independence, and refusing to be controlled by money or fame. He told them how he had fought for dignity and paid the price, but he never spoke with bitterness. They can take your jersey, he once said, but they can't take your name. Over time, his message grew louder than his statistics. As the 1970s and 1980s unfolded, new generations of players began to echo what Cookie had preached decades earlier: that athletes were more than property, that they deserved a voice, that their silence was complicity. He didn't live lavishly, he wasn't celebrated by the league that once marketed his power, but his principles never wavered. When cancer found him later in life, he fought it the same way he ran through defenders: head on, no fear, no surrender. By the time he passed in 2011, Cookie Gilchrist had become something greater than an athlete. He was proof that courage doesn't always end with applause. Sometimes it ends in quiet dignity, with the man standing alone, unbroken, while the world finally catches up to the truth he spoke decades before. Yet, even in death, the silence around his story lingered. A silence that spoke volumes about the league's uncomfortable history with the men who refused to bow. And that's where Cookie's legend turns from tragedy to truth. Because the same league that buried him is now built on players who embody his defiance every Sunday. In the decades that followed Cookie Gilchrist's exile, the NFL changed, but not nearly as much as it pretended to. The league that once silenced him now celebrates social justice slogans on helmets and end zones. But long before hashtags and press releases, Cookie was living that message, alone, broke, and unwavering. His story isn't just about football, it's about freedom: the freedom to speak, to question, to demand respect when silence would have been easier. Every modern player who takes a stand, every man who kneels during a national anthem, questions ownership, or demands fair pay owes something to Cookie Gilchrist. He was the prototype for athlete activism, the voice that shouted in the void before the microphones were ready to listen. Jim Brown called him one of the strongest men he ever met. Others described him as impossible, volatile, misunderstood. But the truth is simpler. Cookie refused to be managed. He wasn't a brand or a statistic or a headline. He was a man trying to live with dignity in a business that treated dignity as a liability. And now, when the lights go down in Highmark Stadium or Mile High, when fans chant for stars who will never know his name, the echoes of Cookie Gilchrist will still hum through the grass. Because courage leaves fingerprints on the game, on the culture, and on the men who come after. So when we talk about legends, we can't just count yards or rings. We have to count the ones who refused to bend, the ones who spoke up when it cost everything. Cookie Gilchrist didn't lose his career, he gave it up for a principle that still makes the league uncomfortable today. The stadium is quiet now, the seats are empty, but somewhere in the dark, that old warrior still stands on the 50-yard line, hands on his hips, staring up at the lights, daring history to forget him again. If you remember this era, or if you believe some stories are too powerful to stay buried, subscribe for more untold NFL legends, because history in this game never really stays buried.